We've covered a lot in the class so far, and we're not even really that deep into the semester. But one thing that we haven't touched on very much would be what we call foreign policy, the way that the United States interacts with the global community, and that's what I want to talk about here today. For those of you that have taken the early American history class, you probably could tell me a thing or two about a concept known as manifest destiny. This concept really emerges really in the 1840s as Oregon fever is beginning to build up momentum. And there's a lot of people that are saying that it is our destiny to have this continental sea to shining sea empire. But it's not just our destiny, it's our God given destiny, which really begs the question, why does God want us to have that territory? And where most Americans are on this is very much in the camp of Theodore Roosevelt, who was a real big fan of colonization, manifest destiny. And he just asked the question, who wouldn't want to be an American? Who wouldn't love that, right? Our political system, our economy, our technology, our culture, our industry, it's so much more advanced than anywhere else on the continent, maybe even the world, that it would be good for you to become an American. Certainly, it would be good for us to have access to your territories, right? This leads to rising tides of patriotism, it leads to nationalism, but generally speaking, not everybody, but certainly many, many, many Americans agree with Teddy Roosevelt in the sense that manifest destiny is a good thing. But the actual reason that we're thinking about conquering a continent has everything to do with our economy. I'm hopeful that you're able to take away that from those lectures when we were talking about the development of first the Great Plains and eventually the Far West, that those were really important to our economy. But by 1869, not only had we conquered the North American continent, we had laid a railroad track over it. You got the Transcontinental Railroad. And for all intents and purposes, what that meant was that the western frontier had essentially been closed. And there's some psychological trauma that comes along with this because if you remember my lecture from a few days ago, Frederick Jackson Turner describing the frontier thesis and the West had always been the driving force in American history, and now that driving force is essentially gone. There is no more West, there's no more frontier. There's a lot of people that are looking at this situation and applying this Darwinian social theory to it. It's survival of the fittest. We can either colonize or be colonized, but make no mistake about it. By the end of the 19th century, the reason that we're beginning to look overseas has everything to do with our economic necessities, right? Overseas markets are going to take on an absolutely enormous importance because we're beginning to replace Great Britain as the workshop of the world. And there's only so much of that output that we can, absorb from American consumers. We want to sell our goods and our products throughout all corners of the world, and we want to do it the way that the British have been doing it for generations. We don't want to just have a chance to compete. We want to force our goods on people the way that the British were forcing their goods on the Irish, and the way that they told the Irish since the 1530s that they could only buy their stuff from Great Britain and sell their stuff to the British. That's what we want because it was very, very good for business. But if we're going to turn over this new leaf in our foreign policy, then we're really going to have to rethink our whole diplomatic approach. And ever since the end of the War of 1812, our approach had been isolationism. The Secretary of State under James Monroe was a guy by the name of John Quincy Adams, and he advised the president to issue what would come to be known as the Monroe Doctrine. Now, this is more of an early American history thing than it is anything else, so I'm going to forego the definitions, but hopefully most of you understand that what the Monroe Doctrine is designed to do is to keep Europe out of the Western Hemisphere, and it says if Europeans agree to stay out of our business, we won't meddle, we won't interfere in yours, right? That was isolationism, and that really did define our foreign policy for most of the 19th century. if we're gonna if we're gonna sell our goods and products throughout the world, we're gonna have to get rid of isolationism, because as it is right now, most of our diplomats amount to Christian missionaries that are trying to convert masses elsewhere throughout the world. We need the establishment of ports, we need trading networks, we need to establish tough military bases. Speaking of getting tough, we need to throw people like the British out of the Western Hemisphere, because even as late as the 1890s, you still do have a European presence in the Western Hemisphere, and you'll see what I'm talking about here in a minute. But more than anything else, what's really going to become important would be establishing American provinces throughout the region, right? And the region would be the Pacific. I'm going to give you three examples. One is going to come to you in 1867, and it's what you call Alaska. In that year, the United States purchased the Alaskan territory from the Imperial Russians for $7.2 million, which was an absolute steal of a bargain. It was absolutely a highway robbery, but not for the reasons that you probably think. It's not for the gold, it's not for the coal, it's not for the oil or the timber or any other natural resource. It is its location. Think about where Alaska is. It's the Pacific Northwest. What Alaska brings to the table, in addition to all the things that I mentioned, is its location, because now, because we own it, we can keep an eye on that part of the world. And more importantly, we can control the flow of goods and people in the Pacific Northwest. We liked this. We liked it so much that in the 1870s, we began to establish a presence in the South Pacific, what you call the Samoan Islands. If you've ever flipped on C-SPAN or some other political, news network like that, and you've seen some congressman from American Samoa, and you've asked yourself, why does the Samoan Islands have representatives in Congress? It's because the Samoan Islands are American territories. And the reason why they're American territories is the United States annexed them in the 1870s, which gave us a very commanding presence in the South Pacific. We like that a lot too. We liked it so much that by the late 1890s, we established a very important presence in the Central Pacific, and many of you probably know where I'm going with this. That would be the Hawaiian Islands. Hawaii was an independent kingdom for the most part before the United States simply said, congratulations, you are Americans now. And by the way, the only people that you can sell your sugar to, once upon a time it was sugar that was the main export of the Hawaiian Islands, the only people you can sell your sugar to is us, and the only people you can buy your steel, your coffee, your textiles, all your manufactured products, that would be from us. We're doing to Hawaii what the British have been doing to their colonies for years. We're forcing our goods on them, right? And in the process, we established a vast empire in the Pacific, and we became a force to be reckoned with in that part of the world, right? But we're also going to need a military overhaul if you're going to protect those provinces. It's one thing to buy Alaska, it's another thing to ward off people that might come sniffing around your territories. One guy that understands this very, very well is the man that you're looking at on the screen there, if you're following along with me in the PowerPoint. That's Captain Alfred T. Mahan. And he is an official within the U.S. Navy, but more importantly, he wrote this book entitled The Influence of Sea Power on History. It's a very long book, and basically what it boils down to is this. All the great nations in the history of the world, whether we're talking about the ancient Romans way back then or the Great Britain right now, they've all had one thing in common, and that is they've all had a world-renowned navy. The reason that the Navy is so important, Mahan argued, was that you can control the seas. And if you can control the seas, you can drain out of certain regions of the world what you find valuable. In other words, you don't have to control all of Africa just to get out of Africa what you want, what's valuable. And the British, he argued, had been doing this for years at the Suez Canal. It is where modern-day Egypt is right now, and it's where the Mediterranean Sea meets the Red Sea, and the British, they control all the goods and people that are moving through that part of the world, and they're getting a little taste of all of that action. It's making them very, very powerful, and they don't even have to have the burden of ruling over great big huge chunks of Africa. That's what Mahan is arguing the United States needs to do. One, build a great and powerful navy, and two, use that navy to establish a very strategic networks of ports, right? It doesn't have to be great big huge empires like what the Spanish had established in the 1500s. You just need to control the parts of the world that can make you wealthy. So, that is really where we're going to go when it comes to reinventing this foreign policy wheel. And we're looking closer to home when it comes to establishing key ports for control. But it's one thing to just simply go ahead and tell Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, and it's another thing for us to start gobbling up territories in the Caribbean. Enter into our conversation an island nation 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and that would, of course, be Cuba. Now, in 1898, Cuba was a colony of the crumbling Spanish American Empire. We had wanted Cuba for a long, long time. And in the 1890s, we got an excuse to take it. What is happening in Cuba at that period is basically a civil war. The Cubans are rebelling against the Spanish and they're pushing for their independence. And back in New York, there's a guy by the name of William Randolph Hearst who would be to newspapers what Andrew Carnegie was to steel. He was a massive, massive newspaper magnate. And he bought this failing journal called the New York Journal, and he used the New York Journal to write about some of these Spanish atrocities, these crimes against humanity in Cuba that the Spanish were committing. This brand of journalism comes to be known as yellow journalism. It's not that much different than what we were talking about with the progressives and muckraking journalism. And it tells all these dirty little nasty things about the Spanish and all the evils that they've been up to 90 miles off the coast of our shores. And the Americans eat it up. They just cannot keep copies of the journal on newsstands. But the either intended or unintended consequence is that a lot of these people start calling their congressmen, start calling their senators, and demand that America do something about the Spanish atrocities in Cuba. The guy that is president of the United States at this particular moment would be William McKinley, and he doesn't want to go to war, partly because he had served in the Civil War. He understood what war involved, and it was not very glorious. And also partly because he feels that we're not quite ready. No, Spain is not the Spain of old, but it's certainly a force to be reckoned with, and we're not really ready to take on somebody like that just yet. So instead of declaring war, what McKinley does is he sends this brand new naval destroyer, the USS Maine, into Havana's harbor to press upon the Spanish. We wanted this nasty business to stop. You need to start treating the Cubans better. You need to start negotiating some sort of peace, because if you don't, we're going to get involved, and that's not going to be good for anybody, right? Well, the Maine hadn't been docked in Havana in Spanish territory. They're responsible for this. Hadn't been docked there for much more than 24 hours when it mysteriously blew up. Now, today, what we would call that would be an act of terrorism, right? They called it an act of sabotage, that clearly this was the evil Spanish that were reminding us to mind our own business, but more importantly, now Spain has American blood on its hands. Later on, in the 1970s, the U.S. Navy did an investigation as to exactly what happened with the Maine, and they found that American sailors had this really bad habit of putting munitions, things that go boom, next to the coal chambers, things that get hot. You don't have to be a physicist to understand what's going to happen next, but nonetheless, most people bought this up, that it was the Spanish that had sunk the Maine, and at that point, there's nothing more that McKinley can do to resist. He's got to declare war. He does, and it comes to be known as the Spanish-American War. Now, the guy that is the secretary, excuse me, this assistant secretary of the Navy in this period is our good friend Teddy Roosevelt. This is where Roosevelt is really going to become a household name, charging up San Juan Hill. You may or may know or not know the story of the Rough Riders, but in any case, Roosevelt gets in the ear of the man that you're looking at on the screen there. That is George Dewey. He's the admiral of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet. And he says, listen, Dewey, the minute that you hear the United States has declared war on Spain, I want you to throw everything that you have at the Spanish in the Philippines, right? The Philippines are on the opposite side of the world. They don't have anything to do with Cuba. The reason that he wants Dewey to knock out the Spanish in the Philippines really is two reasons. Number one, that is where many of their boats in their navy are docked. That will be advantageous to Cuba, but probably more importantly, the Philippines were Spanish territories. What we wanted were territories. We especially wanted territories that were very near to the mainland of Asia. We wanted a chance to move our goods and our products into places like China and India. The Philippines were a stone's throw away from those markets. And similar to what Mahan had been talking about, Roosevelt realizes that you don't need to plant your flag on all of Asia to drain out of Asia what you want, which is access to those markets. So it's not a coincidence whatsoever that Roosevelt told Dewey, go after the Philippines. And they do. The war itself is described as a splendid little war because it was very decisive. It was also very short. 1899, the Spanish are going to sue us for peace. We will establish peace in the Treaty of Paris. And it was relatively cheap in terms of American lives. But back to this treaty. One of the things that the treaty emphasizes is that Spain was going to have to give up some of its territories. They were bad colonists, they had broken lots of laws, and to punish them, they needed to give up their territories to us. What the Treaty of Paris will make the Spanish relinquish is the Philippines, or are the Philippines. We got the Philippines, and the Philippines became a U.S. territory, a colony, in the aftermath of this war. We also made them give up Guam, another island nation off the coast of mainland Asia, again, very strategically located. Guam becomes an American protectorate, okay? And lastly, Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is nicely located right there in the Caribbean Sea, and it made a very nicely strategically located port. And it was also a Spanish territory, which they gave up to us as in accordance to the Treaty of Paris. In short, here's what happens with the Spanish-American War. We didn't have an empire before the war. After the empire, we had a great, I said that backwards, after the war, we had an extensive empire, okay? I'll say this about the rest of the world for right now, and then we'll need to move on. We're not the only ones watching this play out. There's a lot of people, especially people in Europe, to a lesser extent Eastern Asia, that are watching this play out with some dollar signs in their eyes. You'll see what I'm talking about the next time, but for right now, I want to talk about people that dissented a little bit. People that didn't like the idea of the United States becoming an empire. I know what you're probably thinking, that we were once a colony and we did not like the way that the British were treating us and we rebelled and got our freedom and so on and so forth. That was really not the mantra of the Anti-Imperialist League. It wasn't that they had a problem, a moral dilemma with the United States becoming an empire when we were once a part of an empire ourselves. We didn't want the people that came with the empire, right? What people like Andrew Carnegie, people like Samuel Gompers are worried about is if you make Puerto Rico an American protectorate, what you're also going to get would be Puerto Ricans. That would be problematic according to this xenophobic, racist line of thinking. And so the Anti-Imperialist League what they're doing is they're lobbying Congress to not take these territories as American protectorates. As a matter of fact, Andrew Carnegie, who's a card carrying member of the Anti Imperialist League, got out his checkbook and signed a check made payable to the U.S. Treasury for $16 million, which is exactly what we paid Spain for their former territories. He says, listen, I don't want a dime of this back, just don't take the territories. Obviously, we don't listen to Carnegie, but you can see that they did not want the United States to become an imperial nation. Probably more importantly is what's going to happen in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War. What was happening in the Philippines was very similar to what had been happening in Cuba. The Filipinos had been rebelling against the Spanish, and when we attacked the Spanish, as probably you or I would, they just simply assumed that we were there to liberate them. I mean, after all, we had been talking a pretty good game about the evils of the Spanish in Cuba, so naturally that's what they assumed. Well, over the course of time, when we never got around to leaving, they began putting two and two together, and they said we should turn our guns on them. And this war in the Philippines is not a war with Spain, it's a war with the Filipinos. And it's going to be a very ugly, gruesome, guerrilla style war. It's going to cost us 4,200 U.S. casualties, which is more than 3 times the amount of casualties with the War of Spain alone. There's going to be atrocities on both sides of this, right? And it's ultimately going to be William Howard Taft as president that's going to put an end to all of this. But make no mistake about it, we just became a colonial power. We became a rich and powerful nation on the global scale, and we did so by picking off a crumbling European empire and then taking apart its empire at the end of that war. Again, a blueprint for people that happen to be watching at the time. But I want to end this conversation talking about the politics of empire. And I need you to understand that not everybody was on the same page with respect to the United States becoming an empire. Certainly, William McKinley was not a big fan of this. As I'd mentioned earlier, he was very reluctant to declare war in general, and he didn't really love the idea of us becoming a colonial power. Teddy Roosevelt, on the other hand, loved the idea, right? On the one hand, he felt that this was going to be good for our economy, and on the other hand, he felt that America becoming a colonial power would really help to balance out that power in Europe. If you know about what's going to happen next in 1914 in particular, you're going to see how very wrong he was. But it's Roosevelt that coins this term, speak softly and carry a big stick, okay? Speaking softly was don't go looking for fights, but if you see one, go ahead and finish it. His big stick was a metaphor for the Navy, right? He really did think that us becoming a colonial power would help neutralize Britain, neutralize France when it comes to going up after everyone else's colonies. But more importantly, what Roosevelt's goal is to consolidate American power in the Western Hemisphere. And he makes good inroads on that in 1901 when his Secretary of State, a guy by the name of Orville Platt, issues something that comes to be known as the Platt Amendment. You know, for all of our huffing and puffing about Cuba and freedom and this and that, Cuba's the one nation that we don't take from the Spanish, right? We do the next best thing. As a matter of fact, you might even see this as better than taking taking Cuba from the Spanish. The Platt Amendment says we can basically do whatever we want, whenever we want in Cuba. Now, officially, we are saying we are the protector of the Cuban people, but what we really mean is we can do what we want economically in Cuba. We can do what we want when it comes to establishing military bases in Cuba. We can do what we want whenever we want to the Cuban people. And we intervene in Cuban affairs again and again and again. It was the best of both worlds. We controlled Cuba and we drained Cuba of everything that was valuable there, and we didn't have the burden of basically governing over that island nation. We liked this idea so much that a few years later, in 1904, we will issue something called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Now keep in mind, what the Monroe Doctrine said was the era of European colonization is officially over, But more than anything else, what the Roosevelt corollary is going to do is it's going to say, just like we're the big brother protectors of the Cubans, we're also the big brother protectors of any other Caribbean nation. Nicaragua, Mexico, Haiti, the Dominican Republic. We will intervene again and again and again. We can do what we want when we want to, as far as the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is concerned. These two issues, these two policies are going to help make the United States the preeminent power, the biggest gun, if you will, in the Western Hemisphere. And it's really going to lead to a commanding presence in a very strategically located part of the world, and that would be the Panama Canal. We had been dreaming of connecting the Atlantic Ocean with the Pacific Ocean for years. And similar to what the British had done with the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal was really going to not only make America very powerful, but very, very rich in the same time. Anybody doing business in that part of the world would have to pay a toll, pay a tax, if you will, if they wanted to move their products from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. What the canal is basically going to do is it's going to provide this shortcut. Think of it sort of like a superhighway system that's going to connect these two oceans. The problem is getting access to it, because at the time, Panama is not the country that you think of it as today. It's actually a province of Colombia, right? And we go to the Colombian government and we ask them, we would like to lease this little plot of land. Would you please lease it to us? And they told us thanks, but no thanks, which infuriated Teddy Roosevelt. You don't say no to us. And so at that point, he opted for this plan whereby he supported a growing independence movement in Panama. Long story short, the Panamanians are successful in winning their independence from Colombia, and they're very grateful to us in the aftermath, and they say, what can we do to show our gratitude? And Teddy Roosevelt said, well, we certainly would love to lease this little plot of land from you. And we do. And when we connect the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, this gives us an absolutely commanding presence in the Caribbean, and we're going to drain billions and billions of dollars, all thanks to the Panama Canal. It's going to make us maybe one of the richest countries in the world at that particular moment. It's not going to be until the 1970s that we officially gave the Panama Canal back to Panama, but that was controversial, as you'll see, in the political atmosphere of the 1970s. But in any case, this is what comes along with becoming an imperial power. Now, as far as Roosevelt was concerned, the one big missing link in the chain, that would be Asia. What we really wanted an opportunity to do was to exploit China the way that the British, the French, the Dutch, everybody had been exploiting China for generations. Problem was, we've got ourselves a rival, and that'd be the Japanese. I've told you this before. Japan is an emerging first world nation, especially militarily. It's not as simple as telling the Japanese to get lost the same way that we are in the Caribbean. What we do is we issue this non-aggressive pact that comes to be known as the Root-Takahira Agreement. What Root-Takahira basically says is there's enough of China to go around. And so if the United States doesn't attack Japan, Japan won't attack the United States. It's a non-aggressive pact. The idea was that the Japanese would get a look of how powerful of a nation we were. They would roll over for us and let us do what we wanted to do. The exact opposite happened, right? If anything, it emboldened the Japanese. And the guy that's going to take over for Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, had always felt that we had gotten shortchanged in the Root-Takahira Agreement, which is a big motivating factor for what he called dollar diplomacy. Taft begins investing very heavily in the Japanese economy, and the thought being, if you control various parts of their economy, you can get them to capitulate to what you want. You can twist their arms, economically speaking, and get them to come around to what you want out of Eastern Asia. It's not really all that successful, but probably more importantly, what Roosevelt and especially Taft do during this period is they set off a 40-plus year rivalry between the United States and Japan that is ultimately going to end in 1941 with the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the launching of the United States into World War II. You'll see what we mean by that when we get to that time period in American history, but I want you to understand something before I let you go. Actually, there's two somethings that I want you to understand. We are going to be this preeminent power in the Pacific, and the one country that can really challenge that preeminence is going to be the Japanese. And it's not a coincidence whatsoever that the Japanese decided to bomb us at Pearl Harbor. The other thing that I want you to understand here is that we were quite proud of this empire. If you look at that slide on the PowerPoint there, a cartoon that was published in the Philadelphia Press, 10,000 miles tip to tip, you'll notice that the bald eagle, the symbol of the United States, is perched on the United States, and it's got its wings spread across the globe. And if you look very closely on that PowerPoint there, you'll see Puerto Rico off the coast of Florida, you'll see Hawaii, you'll see the Samoan Islands. In the background, you've got this rising sun. And I don't know if you're familiar with the expression, the sun never sets on the British Empire, but basically that's what we're saying in this cartoon. We're just as good as the British. We are a first world nation. We do what other rich and powerful first world nations do, and that's colonize the rest of the world. Um, you know, it's the law of unanticipated consequences. We don't understand what kind of absolute hellish storm we're about to unleash, but make no mistake about it. Some of the things that the United States is doing during this time period is not only being watched close by countries throughout the rest of the world, it's going to lead to one of the greatest bloodbaths in human history. You'll see what I mean the next time we meet.